Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Ontario's former children's advocate, Irwin Elman. Elman was appointed as the Provincial Advocate for Children and Youth in 2008. It's a role he held until the election of the Doug Ford Conservatives, who shut the office down on May 1st of 2019. Irwin, thanks so much for joining us. You spent roughly 11 years as the Advocate of Children and Youth in Ontario. Can you tell us a bit about what that role entailed?
Sure. I was an officer of the Legislature of Ontario, which means the legislature was my boss, and I had a piece of guiding legislation that was passed unanimously by the legislature that told me what to do. Basically, I think the actual definition of advocacy in the legislation was I should partner with children and youth to make sure their concerns were heard by decision makers. And the Act gave me some instruction about the kind of young people I was to partner with, and they were young people most marginalized from their rights, including First Nations young people, which were specifically named in the Act.
I think we can all agree that sounds like a rather important job, but shortly after Doug Ford was elected Premier, that office, your role was shut down. What was your understanding of the reason behind ending the role in the Office of the Advocate?
Well, it took me some time to come to an understanding because, frankly, it's not surprising, I think, and thought that it was a really ridiculous decision, damaging. I had asked the minister when I heard about it, and I heard about it the day that our legislation was being repealed, and that's what they had to do. Our legislation was being repealed at the same time as the Environment Commissioner's legislation was being repealed. Was given probably an hour's notice, and I had to tell my staff and certainly the thousands of young people that were involved with us. Asked for an explanation, never got one. Asked to meet the minister months later, even while I was still the advocate. The minister's staff said, no, it's not a good time, and really I've never heard an answer. I thought about it. I thought, maybe it's about saving money, but then they could have cut our budget. And I thought maybe they didn't like the direction our office was going in. My second term and last term was up when our office was closed. They had a chance to appoint another child advocate, somebody, if they thought that, who would be moving the office in the direction they liked. But so that wasn't it. Mm-hmm. Really, what I felt was, in retrospect, they have an agenda to cut budgets, to cut red tape, to focus on open for business, and that meant that they didn't really need anybody protecting the most vulnerable children in the province and their rights, because their rights were going to be compromised by what their plan was going to do. And I thought, yeah, that's probably it.
But what all was lost when the office was ended and closed?
Well, I want to be fair to not just the government, but of course I want to be fair, like we always were. The government did give part of our powers to the Ombudsman's office so that the Ombudsman could receive complaints from children in care of the Children's Aid Society. But the Ombudsman also, when our bill was repealed and his powers were extended to that extent, was told in the legislation that he is not to advocate. The Ombudsman doesn't advocate for children, but looks for administrative fairness. Our job was to always stand beside the young person, to be there with them when they needed support to have their own voice, or they needed somebody to have a voice for them. And that's missing individually. Certainly any systemic reports that we were obligated to make public is missing. And our investigation power, which the Ombudsman does have, but which we were mandated to make any of our investigations public, is missing. And for me, right, when young people are silenced, particularly those who are marginalized from their rights, who aren't often seen, when they're made more invisible, as one young person had told me, when we're invisible, that's when bad things happen. And so I think that young people were imperiled by that decision. I think young people would say that too.
Irwin, much more to talk about here. We do just need to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Irwin Elman, the first and only children's advocate in Ontario. And Irwin, as you know, we do a lot of stories on the child welfare system here at APTN. You've been in many of them. In the last 2 years, there's been a lot of changes that have been announced. Let's start with the federal government's Bill C-92. It was meant to, in large part, keep families together and reduce the number of Indigenous children in care, but that hasn't happened, has it?
No, it hasn't happened. I mean, it's nice to have fine words, you know. In across the country, we have legislation. We have, following the legislation, frameworks. We have agreements. In Ontario, we've had a transformation of the child welfare system. Then a few years later, we had a modernization, and then we had a reorganization, and then we had a reset. We have reports after reports, all very nice words. The toughest thing for government to do is to have these nice words find their way into children's lives. It's a gap, if not a chasm, between that. And so, yeah, that's where we are. I agree around the federal legislation with Cindy Blackstock, and I try and agree completely with her oftentimes. But she had said, and this is my understanding of what she had said, that, you know, that bill is nice, but without a commitment to funding and support to get that bill implemented, that bill may and probably will just be empty words on a piece of paper. And so I think we need to see that commitment from the federal government to repair what's been done. But it's beyond that, and I know you're going to ask me about Ontario, and because Ontario just had a system reset. If you want, I can mention that because it's similar.
Well, yeah, I mean, this past August there was an announcement of a change in Ontario to go from protection to prevention, focusing on kinship agreements. But you said you felt the project's not about children and families; it's about cost savings. Can you elaborate on that?
I believe that to be true. So I think that. So let me say this: there's nobody working in the system that I've met. There's nobody in the ministry. I kind of know the new minister in Ontario. They're not bad people. They don't wake up in the morning thinking, I want to do harm to children. I don't believe that. And I want to make that clear. But our system is flawed. You know, the system has in its bones this idea that safety is equal to separation. It's 140 years old, the bones of the system. Nothing has changed that. It comes from New York, which came from Britain back then, and it was a system to surveil families of slaves, families of Irish and Italian immigrants to New York. And the idea back then was that, well, these people might not be able to raise their children well, so we better watch them, and if they can't, we'll take the children away. And it had in its bones back then the Humane Society's approach, because animal protection came first before child protection. You know, you look, is the child in danger? Is the animal in danger? You take them away. That's the bones of the system. Nothing has changed with any reset, any transformation. It's still a colonial, and I say this as somebody who knows what a colonist thinks about, it's still a colonial system that has that in its bones. So when we do these resets, right, and we don't change anything. We just allow the child protection system that exists to say, okay, we've got it. We're going to change now. Just keep giving us the money and keep allowing us to keep control over what happens. Nothing will change. Further to that, the government wants to hear that because keeping children out of care saves money. They've already said to the child welfare system, no more money, no new money. If you save money based on keeping kids out of care, you can keep it, but you're not getting more. They've already said that. And at the same time as cutting about $1 billion last year out of the Ministry of Community and Social Services budget. So you allow and you force child welfare with this good news story about keeping kids out of care and keep them in their homes, and then you cut all the services that are available that could support those families with the children in them. It's a setup. Both the federal bill and this system's reset is a setup to children and families. There is no commitment to building a family support system in our province other than to say, Children's Aid, you do it. Yet the Children's Aid is the same agency that's got in its bones, and that hasn't changed. We have to protect these children and separate them from their families if there's danger. It doesn't change anything, and to me, it's a setup.
One of the other things, Irwin, and you're kind of touching on it with this apprehension part, and that's, Ontario, Manitoba, BC have all announced that they're ending the practice of birth alerts. This is basically apprehending the child right from the parents right at birth. But, all these measures that we're talking about and language, we haven't seen a single percentage drop or more than a single percentage drop, especially in Manitoba where we have nearly 11,000 kids in care. We're not seeing the numbers come down. What's it going to take, do you think?
Well, that's because in my mind, and I remember being asked that, Irwin, you're always criticizing the child protection system. Is there a child protection system in the world that works? We want to do what they do. And frankly, there isn't, right? There isn't, because each child protection system is a variation on a theme. It's all about the same. So there isn't one that has better outcomes because we need to change the system. It's systemic. The hope I have, frankly, is in that bill, that federal bill. I remember listening to a former chief from BC who talked to me, and I'm paraphrasing, so if I don't get it right, I apologize to him. But he said, in our community, when a child is born, we have a ceremony where the entire community adopts the child. So it's not just the parent's child, it's the community's child. And in a way, he said, that kind of means we don't need a child protection system, because we have a family support system. If the family needs support, we support the family. If the child needs support, we support the child. As a community, we protect and support and nurture that child. And to me, that's just one aspect of a worldview that's not colonial. Like, it is hard, and I'm talking to you as a colonist, right? It is hard for me, because of my own upbringing in a liberal, democratic, capitalist society, it is hard for me to hold that worldview. My people talk about, it takes a village to raise a child, but we don't believe it. We do not believe it. We think maybe that's a nice idea, but in the end, we believe, no, parents are responsible for their children. If you can't parent your child, you shouldn't have had them. That's what my people say. We cannot hold that worldview that where a community adopts a child. So imagine what First Nations people, free from the colonial system that we impose on them, the colonial child protection system that we impose on them, even with our resets, but with our laws and our court. And we say to First Nations right now in Ontario, First Nations child welfare agencies, you have to use our laws and our systems and our courts. Imagine First Nations communities being able to and supported to create their own systems based on their worldview and culture. It will be completely different. And for me, I think we can look at those systems that are new and recreated and different, not variations on a theme, and we can find a way to learn from you.
Irwin, again, much more to talk about here, but we do have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Irwin Elman, the first and only Ontario child advocate. And we have Irwin, Kenneth Jackson and Colin Crozier are putting out 2 new documentaries in the coming weeks on the child welfare system. As I said, we do a lot of reporting here on the child welfare system. But do you think this is still something that's undercovered in the mainstream?
I have so much respect for your reporters, Ken in particular, who I know is a dog with a bone, and who in many ways is filling the gap that was left by the absence of a child advocate. So I think it's crucial. I still believe that no matter what story that is uncovered, people generally, and I'm thinking about the province itself, generally says, how could that be? How could that happen? Young people who are connected to child welfare say, yeah, we are kind of like UFOs. I remember a young person saying that. We're like UFOs. We're seen when something is going wrong, and then the system takes us into this house, and people just assume everything is fine, and we vanish. And then nobody sees us again until maybe years later when we're dumped out at 18 or 21, and then, not surprisingly, because of the brutalness of the system itself, we're not doing well, and the system has to, other systems have to take care of us, whether it's the justice system or our children, our own children, they say, we enter child welfare, the mental health system. So yeah, I think we do need to continue to uncover these stories to push, because it's only when these stories are in the light, right, can we force ourselves to face them and do something about it. And when I say force ourselves, because the stories that Ken and your other reporters are uncovering are not news to us. Mm-hmm. Like when he's asked me questions, or I know when he's asked the ministry questions or the children's services questions, they're not surprised at his questions. Right. They're saying, yeah, that happens. Yeah, that was, I saw one of his tweets about a rights pamphlet that was being used by an agency that was 20 years old, and it's going to, the workers that were using it goes, yeah, that's it. Or youth moving home to home to home 19 times. Yeah, that's not news. It's not news to the ministry. It's not news to the system. It's certainly not news to young people, but it is news to the public. And we need to continue to tell these stories to ensure that at some point the public says we've had enough. And for me, I hold the ministry accountable. I hold the government accountable. They need to do something. The deaths that Ken has uncovered, I worry about him. I worry about reporters. I worry about the other child advocates that exist in this province who are struggling. I worry about the communities. I worry about the parents. And, at some point, we have to get beyond it. And this is where I think it is in some of the care facilities, that the bar of surviving our attempts to protect them is the success story for children who come into notification of the child protection system. This is not acceptable. And the minister knows that. She receives child death reports every 3 days on her desk of a child, and let me be clear, a child who's connected to the system, not necessarily living in it, but who's connected in some way, maybe living in a family in an open protection case, could have been closed 6 months ago, but still was an open protection case at some time. Every 3 days, a child dies in our province in Ontario. On average, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, a child dies. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, a child dies. On and on and on. And the minister knows this. She gets the reports on her desk. And if she doesn't, she can ask for them. Maybe her staff gets them. She needs to read them and then say, a system reset is not good enough. Certainly our system reset without any commitment to building a family support system in the province is not good enough, because those deaths will continue to mount on her desk. It's not acceptable. And the public has to hear me and others say that, and say over and over again, how can this happen?
Irwin, sorry to cut you off there. I'm glad you raised those numbers, though, and the frequency of them. Here in Manitoba, it was almost 600 kids in a 10-year period.
Wow. Yeah. It's this, and I'm talking about Ontario, but you're right. It is the same story across the country. Different levels of overrepresentation, and you can't talk about child welfare really in Ontario without also talking about the overrepresentation of Black children and families connected to child welfare, particularly in the South, but not only. You can't. And so that system that I talked about, the bones of that system, has racism in it. How could it not, if it's a colonial system built 140 years ago? Really. And that's not to say that everybody who works in the system is a racist. I'm not saying that. In fact, it's not about them. And when I talk about those child deaths, it's not about you, Child Protection Services. Stop. Just stop being defensive. Let's focus on the children and families and what they need. What I'm saying is not news to you. It's not about you. It's about children and how all of us can come together to create something new and support First Nations in creating something new. So those child death reports stop ending up on some minister or some chief's death.
Irwin, there was so much more to talk about here. Unfortunately, we're right up out of time. Though we'll make sure this whole episode gets up on the podcast so people can listen to it in full. But want to thank you for doing the show. Thanks for all the work you did in the advocate's role and the work you continue to do for children today.
Yep, I'm not done. In my teachings, I'm Jewish. We're told that it's not our responsibility to save the world, but we're not exempt from trying. And that's what I'd say to anybody who's listening, is that all of us need to be part of the solution to this. And we need to speak up. Certainly, we need to support children to speak up. And we need to do our best to make sure that the conditions in which love can flourish exist. All of us.
Well, that call out is a good way to end. Again, Irwin, we thank you for your time and for being on the show.
Thank you, Dennis. Take care.
And that is all the time we have for this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. All of our shows are available as podcasts. Some of those, like this one, are extended podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week.